So the European exploration of the African continent really began in the 15th century with the Age of Exploration. The Portuguese developed new technologies and navigational techniques that allowed them to sail to Africa and around it. They found the Gold Coast in Africa when they were exploring, and the Gold Coast is so named for the thriving gold trade that they found that crossed the Sahara. This trade route that crossed the Sahara is known as the Trans-Saharan trade, and it began in the 4th century between the Middle East and West Africa. So really there was it really starts in the Middle East, comes through Egypt and Ethiopia, and heads over into West Africa, which is what we're looking at right now. In this way, also, Islam spread from the Middle East into Saharan and Sub-Saharan Africa from east to west. So you have a lot of Islamic influence in northern Africa. However, gold was really not the only resource that the Portuguese desired. They wanted slaves, and they found them. The Portuguese really thought that slavery was awesome. They thought it was really cool, and we're going to see that in our second lecture too, in a little bit. So they wanted slaves, they found them. They found that a system of slavery already existed on the West African coast, and for this reason it was really fairly easy to trade goods for slaves, and so that those slaves could work in their colonies and in their home country. The other European powers quickly got in on this action, and they started trading for slaves as well. This became the transatlantic slave trade, and it lasted for over 300 years. The transatlantic slave trade began in the 15th century, and it continued into the 19th century. The demand for sugar really boomed in the 17th century, which, as a result, increased the demand for slaves. Between 1640 and 1800 was really the height of the slave trade, and 12.5 million African slaves left the West Coast. So we can sort of see that here. We have 5 million going into South America, 4.5 into the West Indies, but total 12.5 million African slaves left the West Coast. As a result of the transatlantic slave trade, the West African coast was integrated into the European capitalist economy fairly early, and it was colonized earlier than other parts of the continent. So the slaves that left the west coast of Africa, they primarily came from coastal regions, which you could have probably guessed. Whether Europeans traded for them or captured them themselves, the slaves came from what we call catch areas, which were within 200 miles of the coast. So you started the coast, go inward 200 miles. All of the slaves that were sold in the transatlantic slave trade came from that area. You can even see it, it's this sort of gray area where you're looking at West Africa slave trade regions. Those are catch areas. So when the slaves were captured and they were waiting to be sold, they were held in giant fortresses on the coast. The largest of these were in the Portuguese colony of Angola. Surprise, like I said, the Portuguese really thought slavery was cool, so they made this gigantic fortress. They enslaved a lot of people in Angola, and indeed 40% of all of the slaves that left the West African coast came from Angola. And later this became a problem because the Portuguese didn't want to give up slavery when it was abolished in the 19th century, and then they really didn't want to leave when independence was sort of coming around in the 60s and 70s, but we'll talk about that later. So the type of slavery that was indigenous to West Africa was very, very different than our Western ideas of slavery. Slaves were gained through trade, right? But they were also gained as prisoners of war, as peace offerings, and as tribute to other ethnic groups. African slavery was really just one of many different kinds of servile relationships. Slaves had greater rights and could be absorbed into their master's kin group after a period of service. The children of these slaves would be incorporated into the kin group as free people. Slavery was really a means of organizing relationships as well as a way of gaining dependence. Having many dependents was super important in pre-colonial African societies because wealth was found in people and in cattle. In Europe, there are lots of people and only a little bit of land. Land is scarce in Europe. For this reason, land is valuable. Those are the two most really fundamental ideas of economics, that scarce resources are valuable and that land will always increase in value as it is a finite resource. We can't make any more land. But in pre-colonial Africa, land was abundant. There was tons of land. The problem was that people were scarce. In pre-colonial Africa, and in African societies, they found their wealth in people. But this isn't just because the people were scarce, there weren't many people. It's also because people are productive. They can produce goods. For this reason, having more dependents and having more people work for you, it secures the production of food and material goods as well as future kin, right? Because your dependents will have children. Basically, having many dependents secured a, quote, big man's claim over future labor. Having many dependents really granted power. To be a big man, one had to have many dependents. This showed that the big man could take care of many people, and being able to take care of many dependents was a source of power, as it was of capital and status and future productivity, as all of these things were granted through kin. In this way, security is granted through kin. If a big man could keep his people alive, then he was thriving. But if he could not keep his people alive, if a big man's people died or they were not productive, his capital, his status, and his prospects for the future would all decrease, which would then strip him of his big man title. A big man, like I said, is really just a man in power with lots of dependents. So cattle, which I mentioned was the other type of wealth, is really the simpler type of wealth, but it is closely linked with people. Cattle was used as a form of money, as men would pay a bride price to the parents of their intended wives, and the amount of cattle a man could gift would determine the status of the bride that he could afford. So, for example, if a man had a whole bunch of cattle, he could probably afford a wife of high status. And he, too, having lots of cattle, was probably considered of high status, and he could have, if he could afford such a wife. And by gaining wives, the men gain the wife as a dependent, and then that also grants their future children as dependents, which perpetuates that cycle of wealth. So as you can see, the cattle is really closely tied in with wealth and people, but in pre-colonial African societies, wealth in people and wealth in cattle is really super important. It is the bedrock of African societies. But the transatlantic slave trade really changed this policy of wealth and people, and we'll keep seeing changes to this policy as colonialism really starts to take shape in Africa. The new material goods from the slave trade created inequality. So like I said, Europeans would come in and trade for slaves. So they would trade goods, they would trade weapons, they would trade processed silk, whatever, things like that. And these material goods created inequality because only some people could trade slaves, and so only a few people could get these types of goods. So fewer people had more wealth, and thus only a few people could acquire dependents. Additionally, the fundamental nature of slavery in pre-colonial Africa changed as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. It did this in three primary ways. First, slavery developed in places it had not previously existed. Two, in places that it had existed, it became more important. And three, the essential nature of slavery changed to become more like chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is the type of slavery that's practiced in the Americas. In chattel slavery, people were bought and sold, they couldn't become family, and they were treated very poorly. This type of slavery really did not exist in West Africa prior to European intervention. The transatlantic slave trade wound down in the 19th century when the British abolished the slave trade at home in 1807. So they abolished the slave trade in England in 1807, and then they abolished the slave trade in their colonies and abroad in 1833. This didn't end slavery on the African continent, however, and in some cases, the abolition led to more slaves and more trading within Africa. This happened, for example, on the West African coast in Lagos, and slavery became more important to refining palm oil, or palm to make palm oil and palm kernels. And that was really between 1830 and 1900. So clearly, the British abolished slavery abroad in 1833, and slavery is growing in some places on the West Coast because of palm in 1830. So you can sort of see that that didn't really work. So East Africa and West Africa have completely different histories, so I'm going to go over that really quick. While the West African coast didn't really see international trade until the 15th century, except for, with the trans-Saharan trade, East Africa was incorporated into the Indian Ocean trade in the 4th century. This trade route was strongest and most influential between 1000 and 1800 CE. During this period, the East African population grew quickly due to intermarriage with Indians and Arabs, and as a result of this, the Swahili culture developed. Swahili culture incorporates a number of things. First, the Swahili language, the Islamic religion, and powerful trade-based city-states. Swahili, the language, developed along the coast in trade ports. It combined Bantu languages with Arabic, and this language traveled from the coast inland by way of trade routes. So people really only spoke Swahili in cities linked with the with the Indian Ocean trade. Rural people did not speak Swahili, and this is still the case today. If you don't live in a big city, you probably do not speak Swahili in East Africa. Additionally, like the trans-Saharan trade, Islam spread over the East African coast by Middle Eastern merchants and traders, and by converting to Islam, the East African traders had better relations with Muslim traders and kept them from becoming slaves, which is a bonus. And these trade-based city-states were founded and grew during this time. So, in West Africa, kingdoms are being established during this time, but this is not the case in East Africa. Instead, power is being established in cities by way of trade. Mogadishu was established first, but Kilwa was the most important city-state. Kilwa is an island off the coast, which made it an ideal trading port. And on the East African coast, they traded a number of goods, including slaves, gold, timber, raw materials, and food like rice. Unlike in West Africa, again, where slavery was a type of relationship, East African slavery was much more similar to chattel slavery, the kind of slavery that we as Americans know. Slaves were bought and they were sold, and they were used on plantations in East Africa. Most of these slaves never left Africa because the sugar and clove production was so profitable in trade. Additionally, Zanzibar, which is also an island off the coast, became the hub for slaves in East Africa after Oman conquered it in the 1600s. The most important facet of East Africa is in its multiculturalism. Indians and Arab traders moved into to the East African coast, and they intermarried with the locals. This sort of blended culture, it blended languages, and we see this really become an issue, a main tenet of what happens in post-colonial Tanzania, primarily. So we'll talk about that when we hit post-colonialism. So, the scramble for Africa. This is our second point. The scramble for Africa began in the 1880s. A number of things precipitated this move. So, first, Europe was in the throes of an economic recession, and that began in 1873. The prospect of gaining territory that they knew at least contained gold, and they knew it at least contained ivory and diamonds, all of these things they knew about from their history of trade there. This was enough to launch European nations into quests to conquer the continent. However, this was actually not the primary reason to conquer Africa, as the European powers really didn't know what was on the continent. Africa never became central to European economics. It just wasn't that important economically. The greatest motivator for gaining territory in Africa was the strategic rivalry and competition. In other words, the European countries didn't really know why they wanted African land, but they knew that they wanted to keep it out of the hands of other European countries. This is a very tense time, as I'm sure you know, especially like in the 1880s. We're coming up on World War I. Pretty soon after, and then World War II pretty soon after that. So there's lots of European competition going on, and they didn't want other countries to have that land. What if they had discovered something great, right? So, in 1884, the Chancellor of the German Empire, Otto von Bismarck, organized the Berlin Conference. He was trying to regulate the chaos of the grabbing of land in Africa. So the Berlin Conference took place from 1884 to 1885. At the Berlin Conference, the European powers divided nearly the entire continent into spheres of influence. The British gained parts of West, South, and East Africa. As you can see, the UK is there in gold. The French gained most of West Africa, which became known as French West Africa, as you can see there in dark green. Germans gained Tanganyika in East Africa, which becomes Tanzania later. They also gained Rwanda and what becomes known as Namibia there in German Southwest Africa. It's also important to note, this map isn't entirely accurate, by the way. This dark blue in the center, it says the Belgian Congo. At the Conference of Berlin, other European countries gained land, right? These countries gained land. At the Berlin Conference, a single person gained the Belgian Congo, King Leopold of Belgium. His claim to the Congo was recognized at the Berlin Conference. It was legitimized. So the King of Belgium, King Leopold II, he gained a personal colony. It was not the country's colony. It was his personal colony. which is pretty nuts. After he died, it became the Belgian Congo. But at the Berlin Conference, at the time of the Scramble of Africa, it was a personal colony. It was not. It was not a country's colony at all. Additionally, the Italians gained Ethiopia, but the Ethiopian Empire was really strong, and they forced the Italians out. And it was really one of the only regions to not be colonized. As you can see, it's in light green, it's independent. It didn't really work. The Ethiopian kingdom was very strong. They were Christian, so they knew about the missionaries. They already knew what was going on. They were not taken over. Liberia is the other one, but that's because it was an American colony and probably the topic of a different class altogether. So anyway, by 1914, almost all of Africa was colonized and controlled by Europeans. So you may be thinking to yourself, how did the colonists take over so fast? They had the Conference of Berlin in 1884 to 1885, and by 1914, everything's colonized. What the heck happened? Why didn't Africans come together to defeat their common enemy? There are a number of answers to this question, or to these questions. I'll start with the latter. Why didn't Africans come together? Well, Africa is a continent, and it tends to be, as in the case of most continents, not homogeneous. People are different. Many different people of many different ethnic groups existed and lived in Africa for much longer than the history of European intervention. Ethnic divisions and tensions existed in Africa just like everywhere else. And just because the people of Africa had the same color skin doesn't mean that they had anything else in common. Additionally, European intervention helped some Africans, so that's why maybe they didn't come together. I'll come back to this, though. There are three primary reasons for the success of the colonists in the late 19th and early 20th century. First, advanced weaponry. This is pretty self-explanatory, I think. The second is that Europeans have recently developed vaccines, particularly quinine, which is the vaccine against malaria. And third, there were weakened African communities that were weakened by epidemics and epizootics. This is probably the most important reason for European success. It was a really bad few decades for Africa. Rinderpest, which is what we're seeing here, spread throughout the continent, ravaging cattle. It's a disease of cattle. It just it totally decimated the cattle population. And cattle, as you recall, is a major form of wealth in many African societies. Without cattle, a man couldn't buy a wife, and thus couldn't acquire dependents. So that's problematic, clearly. Additionally, cattle was a major form of subsistence, as they were used in farming and also as food. So directly related to the rinderpest epidemic was the increase in sleeping sickness. So we know that we probably heard about this before. Sleeping sickness is carried by the tsetse fly. And it's in Africa. But as cattle died, the tsetse flies had drastically fewer food sources. Tsetse flies feed on the blood of mammals. So they had drastically fewer food sources, and because of this, they flocked to humans. And actually, I'll say that the tsetse fly population was really decimated by the cattle being all dead as well because they couldn't find enough food. But they turned to humans as their primary food source. So this is a huge increase in human incidence of sleeping sickness. Similarly, jiggers were introduced from trade. Jiggers, it's spelled Jiggers. It's pretty gross. You can look it up if you'd like, but you don't have to. They're a type of flea that burrow into the skin, and they lay eggs there. They primarily burrow into feet because they live on the ground. So when people had jiggers, they couldn't walk around, so they couldn't work, they couldn't get food. So, as you could have guessed, mortality rates increased as a result of this, and as well as mortality rates from the sleeping sickness and the rinderpest epidemic. During this time, there were also widespread droughts and famines, which further decreased food and increased mortality. So natural disasters were going on at the same time. It wasn't just diseases; it's also weather. And finally, when Europeans came to the continent, they also introduced smallpox and cholera and influenza, and these things, none of which the Africans had immunity. So Europeans conquered Africa fairly quickly. The first step in colonization, as we'll see in Things Fall Apart, was the introduction of missionaries into Africa. Missionary influence is directly related to colonialism, as the rise of Christianity and thus the rise of missions led to greater colonial success. Like in East Africa with Islam, by converting people to Christianity, missionaries gained control. Missionaries were really the first foot soldiers of colonialism. They were proponents of capitalism, and they brought technology and new societal structures, and they established churches which became highly influential, and schools which also became highly influential. So at this point, you may be wondering, well, why would all these people just convert to Christianity? They had, indigenous religions, they had traditional religions. What the heck happened? You may wonder that a lot in this course. Well, there are many reasons for this as well. First, and perhaps most importantly, missionaries brought food and medicine. So, to convert to Christianity meant to get food and greater material security at a time when food was scarce. There was no medicine, so not in the way we Westerners think of it. So we know that there's a famine, there's rinderpest, there's drought. People are dying all over the place, and missionaries bring food. I'd convert for some food if I was starving, So that's probably the most important reason. But second, Christianity also allowed for outcasts or people on the outskirts of society to gain a new community with the possibility of upward mobility, which they would not have had in their previous community. And finally, missionaries were advocates of abolition, which many Africans supported. In some cases, traditional religions and Christianity shared doctrine, which also made it easier for missionaries to convert Africans. And in this way, when Christianity came to Africa, because of the similarities and because of the differences, Africa was Christianized, yes, but Christianity was also Africanized, because this religion changed. It doesn't look like European Christianity. So the European nations, after establishing missions, they set up colonial administrations in their new colonies. There were two major styles of ruling, direct and indirect. Direct rule is the more traditional style of colonial ruling. The French, Portuguese, and Belgians prescribed to this style of rule. They brought in large numbers of administrators. They created capitals at which many of the administrators would be stationed. They dismantled the existing ruling structures. They established new ones. And there was a major difference between the citizens of the empire and the subjects of the empire. For instance, the difference between French citizens and African subjects, right? Finally, this style of rule is very, very expensive, as it necessitates more officials and more European goods. So there's more importation happening. It's really expensive. And as we know, we're in the middle of a recession at this time in Europe, so that's not so good. So the answer to this is indirect rule. Indirect rule was the style used by the British. It made use of, quote, existing African rulers and ruling structures. All of those things are in quotation marks because, well, it's just not real. Frederick Lugard really took this idea from the existing structures in northern Nigeria, and he applied them to all the British colonies. So the Sokoto Caliphate in northern Nigeria was organized around a number of largely independent polities that all pledged allegiance to the Sultan of Sokoto. So the Sultan utilized the leaders of these independent entities to enforce laws and collect taxes and keep people in line, basically. So this is essentially a system of delegation from the primary or head leader to smaller leaders, and then to even smaller leaders, etc. So Lugard, who you can see here on the left, that's Frederick Lugard, he used this system in all the British colonies. He instituted this type of administration in places it had not previously existed, and he claimed it to be a native administration, which is why I said that those existing African rulers and existing ruling structures should all be taken with a grain of salt, because that's just not real. But indeed, native people were used in colonial administrations and colonial courts rather than importing people from the home country. So these administrative jobs paid really well. They granted higher status for those who may not have had any opportunities for advancement before. And so that's maybe another reason why people wouldn't want to band together to go against European intervention, because it really did help some people. It changed the opportunities for some people and it made them better. Not everybody, or even most people, I'll say, but for some people this was a good thing. And that's not to be taken lightly, I think. So this created new big men, and it created rising competition among the men for leadership positions. And finally, it further changed the traditional style of wealth and people, because of now you have a completely new form of wealth. So for the British, this style of rule was cheap and efficient, and that's super important because of the economic recession at home. They don't have money to throw into a whole bunch of new colonies. They don't even know what's there. They don't know what to do about it. So using and establishing a system of delegation was really helpful. So the British colonial government saved money with indirect rule, but they also gained much needed money from the different types of colonial economic structures. So there are three primary types of colonial economic structures. The first is trade. The trade economy includes the transatlantic slave trade, but then as the transatlantic slave trade was abolished, the trade of cash crops like palm, cocoa, tea, cloves, groundnuts, etc., the trade economy for this became very important. The second type of colonial economy is from concession companies. A concession company rented land from the colonial government, and it agreed to pay the government a portion of their profits. This type of economy includes mineral reserves, timber, rubber, diamonds, and gold. We're going to see this in South Africa when we talk about the history of South Africa in a few days. And then third, labor reserves. We're going to see this in Kenya. We're going to see it in South Africa too, but primarily Kenya. These were the labor reserves were most common in settler societies in southern and in eastern Africa. They consisted of labor migrants who moved to plantations and mines to work for money. So the need for Africans to make money suddenly increased with colonialism. They didn't really need to make money before. It was subsistence living. But the colonial administrations came in and they introduced a hut tax for every home. So basically for every house in a compound or every house in a village, there's a tax being put on these houses, and you can't pay for these taxes in like yams or cattle. You have to pay for them in actual money. So these new taxes forced men into wage labor. As a result of this, the gender roles drastically changed because men had to leave their homes for long periods of the time. They're doing work that they didn't really have to do before, and women, their roles and their work really increased. So households that once had wealth in cattle and wealth in people now had to send members of the family to work for the colonists. So we're seeing again a change in wealth. Finally, the colonial government depended on these labor reserves not only on plantations and in mines, but also in developing infrastructure. So as a quick recap of this lecture, we started at West Africa and we looked at the transatlantic slave trade. We talked about the trans-Saharan slave trade and its religious impact. And then we looked at the different types of wealth in pre-colonial Africa, in wealth in land in Europe, but then wealth in people and wealth in cattle in pre-colonial Africa. We talked about the essential nature of slavery in pre-colonial Africa, as well as the way that it changed with the transatlantic slave trade. We talked about the history of East Africa, the Swahili language, Swahili culture, and then we talked about the scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference, the Berlin Conference, the splitting up of Africa. We talked about the role of missionaries, and then we talked about the colonial administrations, both direct and indirect rule, the reasons for European success, and finally we talked about colonial economic structures. If you find you have any questions at all at the end of this lecture, please send me an email. I know that some of these themes, some of these ideas are kind of difficult, and especially if you've never been exposed to them before. So please send me an email if you have any questions at all.